one ever said to me, announce in this style or that style in the beginning.
Kind of the fake it till you make it, right? I know you said Gorilla Monsoon. He's a legendary figure, and no matter WCW, WWF, whatever you watch, Gorilla Monsoon is a legend of the business. And you hear a lot of great stories about Gorilla. He was a bit of a gambler, some would say. What was your experience like with Gorilla Monsoon?
Yeah, I always had this huge roll of bills in his pocket. And we both live in New Jersey, and Atlantic City had just opened up. So he spent a lot of time down in Atlantic City. He just loved the casinos. And like you said, he loved to gamble. But he was wonderful. His family was wonderful to me. I would go over to his house, and he had a finished basement, and we'd play pool. Yeah, he was like an uncle to me in those early days.
That seems like the general consensus. Everybody said how great of a man he was and what kind of an impact he had on the business, especially with Vince Jr. Now, I read this. Feel free to dispel these rumors, but I read that your time in the WWF ended after an argument with Vince McMahon. Was that true?
No.
Oh, okay. That's
no argument.
Okay.
It was. I think it was after WrestleMania 1. And I had an opportunity to announce on ESPN. I knew I didn't have a future with them. It is true that Vinny, he never showed any respect. He never showed that he cared for me in any way. And I think that was territorial on his part because it was more like I was Monsoon's announcer and Howard Finkel was Vinny's announcer. And I think that had a lot to do with it. Although the other thing I always thought was I was financially independent of wrestling. I didn't need wrestling to earn a living. And he didn't like that because I believe he felt that he couldn't control you if he wasn't supporting you. So, in the 11 years that I announced, and 8 of those years was on WWF TV, he spoke to me 3 times. Like, he acknowledged my presence 3 times.
Wow.
And he did fire me from the Spectrum. We didn't have an argument. There's nothing to argue about. The boss tells you, we don't want you to come back here anymore. You don't come back. I mean, there's, at one point also, I had asked for a raise while I was doing their All-Star TV show. And that was considered, you didn't do that. You didn't ask for a raise. You just took what was handed to you and was grateful. That's what most guys did. But I asked his father, Vince Sr., and I was ready to defend myself and to come back with whatever he might say as to why I deserved this raise. Except he gave me the one answer that I wasn't prepared for, which was, I can't afford it. Now, I'm looking at a multimillionaire who controls New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philly, Washington, Baltimore, New Haven, and I was just, but at the end of the night, that extra money that I asked for was in my envelope. And for every TV after that, I got paid the higher amount. It's just that the McMahons couldn't say, yeah, you deserve it. Yeah, you do a good job. Because they wanted to exert certain control over you. They didn't want you to get a big head. And, that's just how they operated. And if you read Justin Roberts' book, not much has changed.
I was going to say, it seems like today and no disrespect to anybody, but the apple really doesn't fall far from the tree. You see a lot of the things that are going on. 2 years ago, Neville asked for his release from the WWE, and they weren't ready to do that, so they made him sit out an entire year. There's rumors of them doing the same thing with Sasha Banks right now. They don't like things that they can't control, and I guess that's maybe how you become a billionaire. I don't know. I'm not a billionaire. Not a millionaire.
Well, that's a little bit different because those folks signed contracts for a certain amount of money for a certain amount of time. Now you can ask for your release, but you shouldn't expect it. Otherwise, what's the point of a contract? I think WWE is within their rights to hold that. I mean, they're adults. I'm sure they have financial advisors. And even if they don't, they signed a contract. So, yeah, I mean, when I was with WCW, I would never think of breaking a contract. You know, every May we would renegotiate. And that was just the way it was. So I don't have a problem with them holding people to their word. I may not like their contracts. I may think that they're not independent contractors and they should receive benefits and so forth. But if you agree to it, then I think you should live up to your agreement.
I would agree with you. I think as a fan, it's difficult right now because to me, what it seems like the WWE is doing, and Joe and I were speaking about this yesterday off air, is they're just buying up all of the talent. Sorry, a little bit of feedback there. They're buying up all the talent they can to prevent them from going to other places. And there's not enough. I know they have 5 hours, 6 hours of TV a week, but there's still too much talent for that amount of TV time. So I think, us fans see it as, we're not seeing our favorite wrestlers week in and week out, and maybe they're a little bit bitter towards them right now.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with a wrestler asking for an early release, but if they don't get the early release, don't pout about it. You made an agreement, so stand up to it.
That is a good point. That's a fair point. And, business is business. And you mentioned, your time in WCW. So after you left the WWF in 1985, I believe you signed with WCW in 1989?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How were you following the NWA at that point? Being a wrestling fan.
There was a transition period. When I left the WWF, I started working for the AWA, Vern Gagne. When he started his ESPN show, it came from Atlantic City. So I started that show with them until they moved it to Las Vegas. And I wasn't able to travel out to the shows in Las Vegas, but Vern would call me in to do his pay-per-views. So I did Wrestle Rock in Minneapolis on pay-per-view, and I also announced Super Clash 3, the Kerry Von Erich, Jerry Lawler main event in Chicago. And in the meantime, I was announcing for the NWA live shows in Baltimore and at the Meadowlands. When Vinny expanded, Jim Crockett and Vern Gagne teamed together to form Pro Wrestling USA, and they came into the Northeast, a combined promotion. So I started to announce for them. So there was a transition period. I worked for a few years every month in Baltimore for Jim Crockett. And then whenever they would come up to the Meadowlands, there's that viral video of, that was WCW. Now, so that was a little later. Yeah, so I had worked for them. They knew my work. And how I came under contract with WCW was Jim Hurd, who was the executive vice president, the first one, saw me announce an AWA pay-per-view in December of 1988 from Chicago. And he sent word to tell me that I needed to stop announcing their pay-per-views, because by then I was doing I wasn't under contract, but I was doing WCW Clash of Champions. I was doing their pay-per-views. And my reaction was, well, if Jim has a message for me, why doesn't he just call me? Like, why is he sending it through anybody? But if this is how he wants to communicate, you can tell him to go shove it, because unless he puts me under contract, I'm not turning down any other work. And that's how I got my first WCW contract.
Wow. I mean, persistence pays off. That's a lot of, you said week after week. That's a lot of shows. Now, you were in both. I mean, at the height, you were in the WWF right before WrestleMania 1. You were in WCW in the late 80s. How did the atmosphere in those two companies differ?
Actually, I hold the distinction of being the only individual, because there was a transition period, of being the only individual to work for the WWF, the NWA, and the AWA all at the same time. Because Vinny was in the Meadowlands, so I announced the WWF shows. And then 2 weeks later, Pro Wrestling USA would come in, and I would announce their shows. And it didn't last long because I didn't feel comfortable with it. And that's really what caused me to leave the WWF. So getting back to your original question, no, there was no discussion about leaving. I just stopped going. And, it was just a natural thing. I knew I didn't have a future there. Now, of course, I didn't even try to stay. I didn't want to stay because, remember, you have to look at it through 1984 eyes. Before WrestleMania, before anyone could ever predict as to how huge, WWE would become. But it wouldn't matter, because we just didn't, he didn't like me. So I didn't dislike him so much. I have little respect for him as a person, but I have a great deal of respect for him as a business person.
And to be fair, I think a lot of, your best work came through WCW. To me, some of the most iconic announcers is for Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors. This is Sting. I mean, you were the voice of really that boom for that. I guess the transition period for WCW too. You had a lot of great stars come through, and you were there for all of them. We opened it up to a lot of our listeners here, and they got some. They had some questions for you. So I want to run a couple by you, personal questions.
Sure thing.
Who was your favorite person to announce?
I didn't have a favorite person to announce. And it also would depend upon the decade of my career. Because as a kid, as a fan, Bruno Sammartino was my hero. So whenever I had an opportunity, and it was often that I introduced Bruno, that was cool. In fact, that very first night that I stepped in the ring in Wildwood, Bruno was in the main event. So, to a 21-year-old kid, my knees were knocking.
Yeah, no pressure in that kind of situation.
Yeah, not really any one in particular. The Sting introduction came because I'm from the old school and I boom my announcements. And Sting, if you were to shout Sting, it closes your vocals. So I needed like a running start for that. So I just created a couple of words leading into Sting, and it became This Is Sting. I didn't always hit it because the way I boom and the way that closes your throat up, isn't always compatible. But what I did, and I always did, was I kept the introductions exactly the same, and they were distinct from each other. It was repetition. And so when people think of Sting, who were fans in the early 90s of WCW, they hear my voice because it was the only way it was introduced. One of the things that, like, sometimes when I watch WWE, too often everyone is introduced the same way. Like John Cena, Roman Reigns, and they're not. I can color your personality by the way that I say your name, and there's an art to it. So everyone was different. Rick Steiner, Scott Steiner, the Steiner brothers. It was just, and I sort of just made it up. No one ever told me what to do.
And 20-something years later, when I think of Sting, I think of that entrance. So you definitely did something right. What was your favorite event to announce?
That also is divided by decades. And there were two 3-match series. One in when I was with the WWF. It was Superstar Billy Graham being the world's champion and Bruno Sammartino coming back for his title. And there were 3 matches in a row in Philadelphia at the Spectrum. 19,500 people, sold out 3 months in a row. That was exciting. And then when I was with NWA WCW, it was the Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat matches from Chicago, from Nashville, and from New Orleans. So those were my favorite series of matches to introduce because I understood the importance of what was going on at the time for the sake of history.
And especially for like the Chi-Town Rumble event, I can remember, the importance placed on that entrance. So that was an amazing set of matches.
Yeah, and if you think of Nashville, who was sitting at ringside, but we had 3 judges: Terry Funk, Pat O'Connor, and